This has been a most unusual Independence Day weekend, hasn't it? Many of us are missing being together with family and friends, enjoying our favorite foods, attending or participating in a parade, and watching fireworks. What are some Independence Day memories that are special to you? Where were you? What made it special? I think back to Independence Days when I was a boy up in Ocean Park, Maine, and how special the parade was, and listening to Pancho's band and watching cars and floats and fire trucks go by. And then when I started being able to participate in the parade and decorating my bike and riding it and chasing after all the candy that people threw from floats. And then at the end of the parade as a kid, you got to have an ice cream treat, and that was such a joy. And then everyone would gather around the bell tower and listen to the band play patriotic songs. A lot of John Philip Sousa and It's a Grand Old Flag was always my favorite. Before this year, perhaps the most unusual Independence Day that our family celebrated was 17 years ago in 2003. When Jill and myself and our sons Nathan and Greg, we were not on Cape Cod, we were not in Ocean Park, Maine. In fact, we were in Stirling Castle in Scotland in the United Kingdom. I was on sabbatical, and as we traveled around, Stirling Castle was a very crucial castle for centuries in terms of controlling access into Scotland from England. Nathan, who was 9 years old at the time, we had bought him a wooden shield and a wooden sword when we were in England, and so he had those with him as he went to the different castles we visited. And at Stirling Castle, two men dressed fully as a Scotsman would, right down to the kilts, saw Nathan coming with his shield and his Brewster baseball t-shirt and said, "Look out for number 9, he's trouble, we've got our eye on you." And later on, we went to a living history presentation in the great hall at the castle that these two men were doing, and we sat right in the front row. And one of the men asked Nathan, remember this is the 4th of July, if Nathan knew our national anthem. And Nathan said, yes. And the men said, then come up and sing it. And Nathan replied, no way, I'm not singing that by myself. Then all of you come up here, the man said. Are there any other colonists here? And a couple women and 2 girls came up and stood next to us. So ended up there were 9 of us standing in front of this big group in this huge hall at Stirling Castle. And the man said, all right, sing. So the 9 of us began singing a cappella the simple, easy song, which is our national anthem. And as we're singing, I can see people, tourists from other countries, walking across the back of the hall, and they're all videotaping what's going on in the hall. So we are on the vacation tapes of people from all over the world singing the national anthem in Stirling Castle. And as we were singing, let's just face it, no one has ever mistaken the Scalise's for the Von Trapp family singers, but we were pulling it off, and some other Americans who had either been too shy or too embarrassed to come up and join us joined in as we got going, and we ended with a big finish. And I was struck by how emotional I felt singing our national anthem in a Scottish castle on the 4th of July, especially because Scottish history is filled with stories of people like William Wallace and Robert the Bruce and many others who fought the English off and on over many hundreds of years trying to win and keep their freedom, and they weren't able to do so. And even today, there is among the Scots a great longing for their own independence. We are lucky, thanks largely to the separation of the Atlantic Ocean that we enjoy so much here on Cape Cod, that our ancestors in the colonies were much more successful at winning their independence from England. Independence Day is a day I think most of us associate with freedom. Freedom is precious, and people have died trying to gain it and trying to preserve it. In November of 1942, when our country was engaged in World War II, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt addressed the joint session of Congress. And in a speech that November, he spoke about 4 essential freedoms. FDR said, "In the future days which we seek to make secure, we look forward to a world founded upon 4 essential freedoms. The first is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way, everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from want, which translated into world terms means economic understandings, which will secure to every nation a healthy peacetime for its inhabitants everywhere in the world. The fourth is freedom from fear, which translated into world terms means a worldwide reduction in armaments to such a point and in such a thorough fashion that no nation will be in a position to commit an act of physical aggression against any neighbor anywhere in the world." Well, these are 4 freedoms that we fought to preserve and for which we still need to advocate. As we celebrate the freedom in our nation, we also celebrate the freedom God has given us. And we're committed to ourselves using our freedom wisely and well as God intends. You know, the apostles Paul and Peter both wrote something significant about freedom. Paul wrote in Galatians chapter 5 and verses 13 and 14, "For you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love become slaves to one another. For the whole law is summed up in a single commandment: you shall love your neighbor as yourself." And in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 16, Peter writes, "As servants of God, live as free people, yet do not use your freedom as a pretext for evil." Freedom is a gift from God that can be used well or used poorly. These verses from Galatians and 1 Peter declare that freedom is a gift from God that can be used well to serve God and to love others, or freedom can be used poorly for self-indulgence or evil. The human tendency to selfishness means that freedom is often used poorly, leading to materialism, abuse, vulgarity, racism, hatred, prejudice, and violence. Late one night, a cheerful truck driver pulled up to a roadside diner to get something to eat, and while he was sitting at the counter having his meal, 3 mean-looking motorcyclists roared up to the diner's entrance, and the atmosphere became very tense as they stalked in, and immediately they selected the cheerful truck driver as their target, and one poured salt and pepper on his head, and another took his apple pie and put it on the floor and stomped on it with his dirty boot. The third one upset his coffee and spilled it into his lap. And the truck driver didn't say a word. He just calmly stood up. He walked slowly to the cashier. He paid his bill, and he walked out. And one of the men sneered, "That dude sure ain't much of a fighter." And the waiter behind the counter, looking out the window, said, "Yeah, he doesn't seem to be much of a driver either. He just ran his truck over 3 motorcycles." Our personal flaws and weaknesses, and our character and virtue are all revealed when we have the freedom to act as we choose. Paul says freedom is a gift from God that can either be used for self-indulgence or used in love to be slaves to one another. Now, those words, to be slaves to one another, may sound very strong in our consumer-oriented, self-centered culture. And Paul isn't even directing them to spouses who are to have the very highest commitment to serving one another in love. Paul is directing these words to all Christians, to the whole church. Freely we have received love from God, not because we are so lovable, not because we deserve it, but because God is an insatiable lover of people. Freely we have received love, so freely we are to share love, even when other people are not lovable, even when we think other people don't, in quotes, deserve it. Often, however, freedom is not used in love. Freedom, sadly, is used to control and to oppress. And the worst things that human beings do to other human beings are often the result of the improper use of freedom. The abuse or murder of people are the most extreme examples of the abuse of freedom. Freedom includes the power to do good or to do evil, to act basely or nobly. And we see this play out in our nation and in the world every single day. The proper use of freedom includes extending the freedoms we treasure to others, including those with whom we may disagree. Choosing the path of Jesus means we recognize the relationship of freedom and responsibility. Perhaps we need to build a statue of responsibility to be placed next to the statue of liberty. Because as creatures of free will, we are responsible for the choices that we make. And in a free society, the proper use of freedom means that we can choose the good when good isn't the only option. When we go on vacation, what is one of the things people worry about? Well, they worry about, while I'm away, will someone break into our house? I read a story about a man who waited in the shadows until a family finished loading up its belongings into their car, and they checked everything, and they clearly were driving away for a vacation. And the man waited until it was dark, and then he went to the front door of the house. He rang the doorbell, and when there was no answer, the man, seasoned thief that he was, had no trouble picking the lock and getting inside. And as a precaution, he called out into the darkness, "Is anybody home?" And he was stunned when he heard a voice reply, "I see you, and Jesus sees you." Terrified, the thief called out, "Who's there?" And again the voice came back, "I see you, and Jesus sees you." And the thief switched on his flashlight in the direction of the voice, and he was immediately relieved to see a parrot that recited once more, "I see you, and Jesus sees you." And the man smiled, and he flipped on the light switch, and then he saw it. Beneath the parrot's cage was a huge Doberman pinscher, and the parrot said, "Attack, Jesus, attack." Jesus sees us, and he observes how we use our freedom. Virtually every week, we see another top executive accused of financial or other ethical wrongdoing. We hear another politician speak inappropriately. We hear self-identified Christians engaging in mean-spirited or cruel speech or behavior. We see people engage in acts of violence and destruction. Unfortunately, there are many, many examples in our culture of the improper use or abuse of freedom. So many, there's really no need for me even to illustrate it. And while it's easy to criticize others for misusing freedom, we need to be reflecting on how we are using freedom ourselves. Because I think a significant amount of the problems and the pain that individuals experience and numerous social ills are due to the failure to properly use the freedom we possess. What choices do we make with our freedom each day? Where do we direct our time, our attention, our resources? What do we do with our body? What do we watch on television or the internet? Do we exercise our freedom and responsibility to vote and to be good citizens and to work for justice for all and for the common good? To quote President Franklin Delano Roosevelt again, he said, "We must scrupulously guard the civil rights and civil liberties of all citizens, whatever their background. We must remember that any oppression, any injustice, any hatred is a wedge designed to attack our civilization." In 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 19, Peter says, "People are slaves to whatever masters them." Christ promises, on the other hand, to make people free, but Christ doesn't promise to make us independent. We are not ultimately free of God or of one another. And the paradox of freedom from a Christian standpoint is the more we submit our will to God's gracious will and become slaves of Christ, the more fully we become servants of God, the freer we become. The proper use of freedom for a Christian is being a slave of Christ and inviting Christ to shape and direct and guide how we use our freedom. We can trust Christ to guide our freedom better than we can trust ourselves. American psychologist William James wrote many years ago, "Bondage to the highest is identical with freedom." Perhaps the greatest use of freedom is the willingness to sacrifice even ourselves or one's life for others, as Jesus did. Jesus gave up the freedom and all that he had as a member of the Trinity and took the form of a slave and laid down his life for his friends, that we might be free from sin and live a spirit-filled, abundant, joyful, eternal life. And throughout American history, over 1 million American sons and daughters have freely and courageously sacrificed their hopes, their dreams, their love, their lives, so we might live as free people, free to think and speak, to worship, to provide for our families, and to live without fear. You know, one of the most moving places I've ever visited, in all the places I've been blessed to travel around the world, are the D-Day sites in Normandy, France, where American, British, and Canadian troops came ashore and began the liberation of France and Europe on June 6th of 1944 during World War II. And 3 years ago, in 2017, we had a group of us there from Brewster Baptist Church, and we walked on and around those beaches. And it almost didn't seem right to be walking on a peaceful beach, a beach where so many men were killed and wounded, and to know that this is where in warmer months you would see people swimming and children playing in the sand and sailboats gliding by, just as we see here on the Cape. And yet the men who fought and so many who died did so in order that people would have the freedom to do just those sorts of things, to enjoy the beach and its beauty in peace and freedom. And we spent time walking around the American cemetery there at Colville-sur-Mer, overlooking Omaha Beach. And I find it difficult to walk in a place like that without being choked up and crying because of all that has been lost that could never be replaced. I think every citizen, and especially every politician, should annually visit American cemeteries, especially in places like Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and Arlington National Cemetery, and our military cemeteries in Europe or in the Pacific, to remember the atrocity, horror, and cost of war, the value and the preciousness of human life, and the courage and sacrifice of so many who were and will always be missed and mourned by those who love them. The chapel at the center of the cemetery in Normandy encourages those who visit. It says, "Think not only upon their passing, remember the glory of their spirit." The same is true of Jesus Christ. It's important to remember not just his death on the cross for our behalf, but the glory of his Spirit and the freedom that we have access to through him. Paul reminds us in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 19, you have been bought with a price, and that price is the life of Christ. We may think our lives are our own, but they really belong to God. Our freedom, our life, our work, our loyalty, our time, our skills, our service, our resources are to be used properly, not to just indulge ourselves, but for the Master we serve, for Jesus Christ. As we celebrate the freedom of our nation this Independence Day weekend, may we also celebrate the freedom God has given us and commit ourselves to using that freedom wisely. May we never forget the spiritual and political freedom we enjoy have been purchased at an incalculable cost. What will we do with that freedom? I pray we will not use it for self-indulgence or as an excuse to do evil or wrong, but that we will use our freedom nobly as servants of God to love one another. Freedom is a gift from God that can be used well or used poorly. Freedom is a gift from God that can be used for self-indulgence or used in love to be slaves to one another. Freedom not only brings out the worst in people, it also brings out the best. Freedom cannot be separated from responsibility. The proper use of freedom includes extending the freedoms we treasure to others, including those with whom we may disagree. The proper use of freedom means freely choosing to follow Christ, to learn his ways of loving and being, and sharing love and compassion with others as Christ did. Perhaps the greatest use of freedom is the willingness to sacrifice ourselves for others as Jesus did. So let us use our freedom to say a prayer of thanksgiving for how blessed we are, to say a prayer of intercession for those who are not, and a prayer of confession for how we have fallen short of fulfilling God's will with the freedom we have been given. May Independence Day weekend be a time when we remember the proper use of freedom and our dependence upon God. Amen.